If any missing persons case we have ever covered belongs on the X-Files, it may be this one. You are watching Disturbed Intent. Before we dive in, please take a second to like this video, leave a thoughtful comment for the family at the heart of this story, and hit the subscribe button so you do not miss our future deep dives into disturbing real-life mysteries. On the evening of September 19, 2004, two hunters, Colton Springfield and his cousin Brent Brooks, were driving out of the Bighorn Mountains after a long weekend of elk hunting. They were tired, cold, and frustrated. They had not managed to bring down a single elk, but the lack of game was not their real problem. As Brent's pickup truck bumped and rattled along the rough mountain road, there was one terrible, undeniable fact hanging in the air between them. There should have been 3 men in that truck. They had no idea where the third man was, or if he was still alive. The missing man was 48-year-old Robert Springfield, Colton's father. Robert was the eldest member of their hunting party, a Crow tribal member and a former Marine who had grown up hunting those same mountains. People who knew him said he could move through that terrain like he had been born from the rock and pine. He knew the big horns like the back of his hand. He had served his country, he loved the land, and he was experienced with both wild animals and bad weather. But in the months leading up to this trip, Robert had suffered a work injury that left him partially blind in one eye. Depth perception, in steep and unforgiving country, can be the difference between a safe step and a deadly fall. So when Robert, his teenage son Colton, and their cousin Brent set out from camp early that morning, they designed a plan that would make the best use of everyone's strengths, while allowing Robert to hunt in a way that felt manageable and safe. The plan was simple. They would split up. Robert would track elk and move them toward an open area. Colton would be positioned on the far side of that clearing, in place to take the shot when his father pushed the animals his way. Brent's role was to wait by the vehicle and be ready to pick them up when the day's hunt was done. It was the kind of strategy experienced hunters use all the time. They had done this sort of thing before. There was no reason to believe that this time would be any different. At first, everything went as planned. The 3 men left their base and moved into the thick, rugged country around a place known as Bear Hole, an area of grassy ridges, deep canyons, and stands of conifer trees. They split up according to the strategy they had agreed on. Colton headed toward the rendezvous spot where he would wait in ambush for elk driven by his father. Brent stayed with the truck, and Robert, partially sighted but confident in his lifetime of experience, moved into the wild to find game. Hours passed. The mountains shifted through their moods. Cold air, drifting clouds, the sound of wind through branches, the occasional distant call of a bird, or the faint rustle of an unseen animal. Colton waited where he was supposed to wait. He expected, at any moment, to see movement in the trees, to hear the crack of branches as elk were driven toward him, to hear his father's familiar shout or whistle. But nothing happened. He waited. The sun moved. The air turned sharper. The silence thickened. There was still no sign of his father. Colton did the right thing. He stayed at the agreed-upon rendezvous spot for a long time, even as the weather began to turn. This was their plan, and he knew better than to abandon it too quickly. But as the hours ticked by and the daylight faded, the conditions around him worsened. The temperature dropped, rain began to fall, and then snow. He was 13 years old, alone in steep, remote country, and conditions were deteriorating fast. At some point, he had to make a choice: stay at the rendezvous spot and risk being trapped in snow in the open, or hike back to his father's Jeep, climb inside, and hope the vehicle could get him back out toward the main road. The Jeep itself was not exactly built for deep, wet snow, and a storm in that terrain can turn a trail into a trap quickly. Colton had to weigh his faith in his father's survival skills against the very real threat of being stranded in the mountains overnight. In the end, he chose to move. Whether it was confidence that his father could look after himself, or fear that the Jeep would not be able to handle worsening conditions if he waited any longer, Colton decided to head back to the vehicle and then out to meet Brent. It was the kind of impossible choice no teenager should have to make. Save yourself and hope the adult returns, or risk your own life in the hope of staying exactly where you were told to be. Colton made it safely to the Jeep, and then to Brent's pickup. The cousins managed to reunite without incident, but by the time they were together again, Darkness was closing in over the bighorns. Snow and rain had swept across the ridges. The temperature was dropping further. And one terrible fact hung over them like a shadow. Robert had not come back. There was no sign of him on the agreed path. No movement on the ridgelines. No sudden phone call with a relieved voice on the other end. Just absence and the cold. At that point, it is not fully clear exactly how the two men managed to alert authorities. Some accounts suggest that they were able to get enough cell reception or access a satellite phone. Other reporting implies that they drove the long, rough miles out of the backcountry toward the nearest town. However they did it, Colton and Brent reached out for help. And to their credit, law enforcement responded quickly. What followed was a massive search operation, the kind of full-scale rescue effort that remote cases like this do not always receive. Deputies from the Bighorn County Sheriff's Office joined the hunt. Members of the county search and rescue squad deployed. Road maintenance workers from the county lent their skills and heavy equipment. Searchers from neighboring Sheridan County, across the state line in Wyoming, came to assist as well. Most powerfully, the Crow Nation stepped in for one of their own. Volunteers from the Crow Reservation poured into the mountains to help look for Robert. They knew the land, they understood the terrain, and they understood the importance of bringing a missing relative home, no matter how hard the search might be. Volunteers on horseback fanned out through the Bear Hole area. Others formed ground teams and began methodical grid searches. Within days, reinforcements arrived from further afield. Canine search teams from organizations like Northwest Canine Search and Recovery in Wyoming, Western Montana Search Dogs, and Hot Springs Search and Rescue joined the effort. The searchers were not just a handful of people casually walking through the woods. This was an organized, coordinated operation involving trained rescuers, multiple dog teams, experienced hunters, and local volunteers who knew the bighorns well. For a week, in rain, snow, fog, and freezing temperatures, they combed ridgelines and ravines across several square miles. A volunteer pilot, also a former Marine, flew a helicopter equipped with infrared technology along steep canyon walls surrounding the Bear Hole area, sweeping for any sign of heat, movement, or a campfire. On the ground, the searchers were supported by employees and volunteers from the Crow and Northern Cheyenne tribes, along with staff from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. These volunteers cooked hot meals for the searchers and for Robert's family, helping them endure long days and cold nights at the search base. Despite all of that effort, there was nothing. No tracks leading to a hidden shelter, no dropped gear pointing in a particular direction, no injured hunter waving desperately at a helicopter. Just silence, snow, and a growing sense of dread. In most missing hunter cases, especially in a place like Montana, the first things people think about are the natural dangers. The Bighorn Mountains are not a gentle landscape. They are home to bears. They are home to mountain lions. And since wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in the mid-1990s, wolf packs have again become a presence in the wider region. Any one of those predators can bring down a person, especially someone whose depth, perception, and balance might be affected by impaired vision. Given the lack of any sign that Robert had made it back toward the rendezvous point, many assumed he had either been attacked by an animal or had injured himself so badly that he could not signal for help. That was the simplest explanation. But as we will see, almost nothing about what happened next fits any simple story. Before we go on to the darker twists and the unexplained details, take a moment to support Robert's family and others like them by boosting stories like this. Please like this video if you have not already, hit the subscribe button, and turn on notifications so you never miss when Disturbed Intent covers another cold, disturbing mystery that still demands answers. A full year passed with no answers. No remains were found in the canyons and drainages. No discarded gear turned up in the snowmelt. For the Springfield family, every season that came and went without news was another reminder that the mountains had swallowed someone they loved and refused to give him back. Then, on October 21st, 2005, something changed. It was a cool Friday afternoon when two elk hunters made their way through the Bear Hole area, not far from where the search command post had been set up the year before. As they moved through the trees, a sound caught their attention. The harsh, insistent cry of a crow. At first, they did not think much of it. Crows are scavengers, and a crow's loud, excited call often means it has found a carcass or something else worth investigating. But as they listened, something about this crow's voice felt different. One hunter later described it as screaming like a woman. The cries were so intense, so persistent, that the men decided they needed to see what was drawing the birds' attention. They followed the sound to a tree near the source of the cawing. There, beneath the branches, they discovered something that turned a strange afternoon in the mountains into the reopening of a nightmare. They found human remains. The hunters did exactly what they were supposed to do. They backed away and contacted authorities immediately. News of the discovery traveled fast. It reached the Springfield family, who drove out as soon as they could, desperate to know what had been found and whether it might finally explain what had happened to Robert. But when they arrived near the scene, they were not allowed to go any farther. Tribal authorities and federal agents had secured the area. The family could not approach the spot where the remains lay. They were kept at a distance, while officials documented and collected evidence. According to Robert's wife, Veronica, and other family members, they were not told exactly what was found or how much of Robert had been recovered. They were given only fragments of information. Later, she would tell a reporter that, as far as she knew, officials had recovered a skull, a large leg bone, and some other bones. To make things even stranger, she said that what she had been told felt incomplete, as if there was more that she simply was not being allowed to know. The remains were not the only things discovered at that scene. Close to the bones, searchers also found items that made it almost impossible to deny whose body this was. Robert's wallet was there. His belt was there. His vest was there. Some accounts say his shoes were there as well. On one level, this should have given the family some closure. Their missing husband and father, brother and friend, had finally been found. They would be able to bury him properly, to grieve with certainty, to stop wondering if he was still out there somewhere alone. But instead of closure, the discovery raised more disturbing questions than it answered. One of the first questions was simple and chilling. Could someone have murdered Robert Springfield? The reaction from law enforcement suggests that this possibility was taken seriously, at least at first. The Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived at the site the very next morning. The FBI does not automatically respond to every death in the wilderness. They usually get involved for specific reasons: organized crime, trafficking, certain federal jurisdiction issues, or at the request of local authorities when there is a suspicion of homicide or a sensitive jurisdictional problem. In this case, Robert was a middle-aged native man on tribal land. Human trafficking was not an obvious angle. There was no public evidence of organized crime. That leaves one likely explanation. The sheriff or tribal authorities called in federal agents because they suspected something about the scene did not add up. Why? At first glance, the obvious explanation for a body in the woods in Montana is exposure, injury, or a wild animal attack. Hunters go missing. Some are never found. Some are found months or years later in remote parts of the mountains. But in this case, there were details that deeply troubled people who knew the terrain and who knew how the search had been conducted. One problem was the condition and position of Robert's belongings. His bow and arrows were missing. His belt was reportedly found neatly rolled up on the ground, as if someone had taken it off carefully and placed it there intentionally. His wallet, which had supposedly spent a year in the elements, showed no clear signs of weathering or water damage. The vest recovered with the remains had a single hole in the back, which at least one officer told the family might have been caused by a bullet. If a wild animal had attacked Robert, when would he have taken off his belt and rolled it up neatly beside himself? Predators do not usually give their victims time to organize their clothing. They do not wait patiently while a hunter carefully removes a belt, sets down a wallet, and arranges a vest. A cougar does not pause in mid-attack while its target politely folds his things. On the other hand, if he had died of exposure or injury, the belt and wallet still seem strange. Why roll up a belt when you are freezing, lost, or badly hurt? Why take out your wallet and drop it on the ground where you might never see it again? Why walk away from your bow and arrows, which are not only tools for hunting, but potential tools for survival? Then, there was the issue of location. Reports and articles often referenced both Bear Hole and an area called Black Canyon, sometimes interchangeably. One newspaper piece suggested that Bear Hole was in the Black Canyon area, even though the specific points known by those names are miles apart. What is clear, however, is that the search command post for the original manhunt in 2004 was set up in the Bear Hole area. And according to family members and searchers who were there, The remains discovered in 2005 were shockingly close to that very spot. One family member, Honeybun Medicine Crow, told reporters that they could have actually seen the spot where the remains were found from the search camp. Another article from the Great Falls Tribune stated that the bones were found roughly 50 yards from where the camp had been established during the initial search effort. 50 yards. Not miles away in some remote, unreachable canyon. Not down in a hidden cave. Not buried under an avalanche. 50 yards from the place where volunteers and professionals had camped, prayed, eaten, and organized their grid searches. People who have never participated in a large-scale search might be tempted to say, well, maybe they just missed him. In some cases, that is possible. Dense brush, steep drops, hidden ravines, and harsh weather can make a body remarkably easy to overlook, even with dogs and trained searchers on the ground. There are many tragic examples of missing people being found later in areas that were supposedly searched. But those examples usually involve extremely dense forest, thick brush, or dangerous terrain people were reluctant to enter. Here, the terrain around the camp has been described as a mix of grassy hills and conifer forest, a landscape that, while rugged, is not impenetrable jungle. And in this case, searches were carried out not just once, but repeatedly over days and weeks in the fall, and then again in later seasons. The Bear Hole search base became a central point that people moved around daily. They launched grid searches from that spot every morning. They returned to it every night. At least a dozen dogs, both scent tracking and cadaver dogs, worked the area multiple times, in multiple weather conditions, across multiple seasons. And yet, we are supposed to believe that an entire human body, plus a belt, a vest, a wallet, and possibly shoes, were lying only 50 yards away the entire time, completely unseen and unsmelled by searchers and canines alike. Is it theoretically possible that every single person and dog somehow missed him? Yes. Is it probable? That is much harder to accept. The simplest way to reconcile these facts is disturbing. If the remains were very close to the camp when hunters found them in 2005, and if we accept that trained search teams did their jobs thoroughly in 2004, then the bodies and belongings likely were not there during the original search, which suggests something chilling. Someone may have placed them there later. Before we move into the questions of jurisdiction, federal involvement, and potential foul play, remember that this is not just a puzzle for true crime fans or a strange wilderness mystery. This is a real family's reality. If you want to support coverage of stories like this, and help keep pressure on institutions that too often ignore cases involving Native victims, please like this video, comment respectfully, and hit the subscribe button to stay with Disturbed Intent as we keep going. The way law enforcement handled the remains after they were found only deepened the sense that something was wrong. According to reporting and family accounts, both tribal and federal authorities essentially shut out the Bighorn County coroner, Terry Bullis, from the investigation. He was not allowed onto the site where the body was discovered. He was not given permission to examine the remains himself. Even though he was the local official responsible for determining cause and manner of death and for signing a death certificate, he was denied direct access to the most critical evidence in the case. Instead, after the remains were collected from the scene, they were turned over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and shipped to the FBI's facility in Quantico, Virginia, for analysis. On the surface, that might seem like a good thing. The FBI has advanced forensic resources. They have laboratories that many small counties do not. But there was an immediate practical problem. In order for Robert's family to access benefits that were owed to them, such as his workers' compensation settlement and Social Security, they needed an official death certificate. Only the county coroner could sign that document, and without being allowed to examine the body, he could not sign it. By keeping the remains away from the local coroner, the process that was supposed to help the family was effectively blocked. Whether it was intentional or not, the result was that a Native family in mourning was denied timely access to both answers and basic support they were entitled to. Some people have argued that tribal authorities simply preferred to let the federal government handle the case because of the complicated tangle of laws that exists around crimes on Native American land. And it is true. Jurisdiction on reservations has long been a legal mess. For many years, tribal police had very limited authority to arrest or prosecute non-Native suspects who committed crimes on Native land. County officers, on the other hand, often lacked the jurisdiction to act on the reservation without special agreements. That loophole allowed far too many outsiders to walk away from serious crimes. In that context, handing the remains over to the FBI could be seen as an attempt to make sure someone with clear jurisdiction and resources handled the case. It might even have been motivated by a desire to seek justice for Robert. But if that was the goal, what happened next does not inspire confidence. The FBI kept Robert's remains for over 2 years. It should not take that long to confirm identity using modern DNA analysis, especially when the man's wallet, identification cards, and personal items were literally found next to the body. In a case like this, DNA confirmation should almost have been a formality. Instead, the bones sat at Quantico through the rest of 2005, all of 2006, and into 2007. The explanation offered to the family was that there was a backlog. That might be true. Federal labs do handle thousands of cases. But when you step back and look at the bigger pattern of what was happening in Native communities at that time, it becomes harder to see the delay as just a bureaucratic accident. During those same years, families across reservations in the United States and Canada were begging for proper investigations into deaths and disappearances of their loved ones. The phrase, missing and murdered Indigenous women, was becoming a movement because so many families felt that police and federal agencies simply did not care enough to fully investigate. Delayed lab work, minimal interviews, and quick, no foul play suspected conclusions were tragically common. In Robert's case, when the FBI finally confirmed that the remains did belong to him, they concluded that there was no evidence of foul play and closed the investigation. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. That is a stark contrast to what many of the facts seem to suggest. Think about the known details together. A highly experienced hunter and marine disappears during daylight hours in an area he knows well. Massive search efforts with experienced volunteers and dogs fail to find him. A year later, his bones and personal items appear within sight of the original search camp. His belt is rolled up as if deliberately taken off. His wallet shows little sign of a year of exposure to harsh mountain weather. A single hole is present in the back of his vest, which at least one officer reportedly suggested might have been caused by a bullet. His bow and arrows are missing. There is no documented evidence that he tried to build a shelter. No documented evidence that he started a significant fire using the lighter he was known to carry. No official note of animal predation on the bones. And yet, the official response is essentially, "We did not find proof of murder, therefore we will not treat this as homicide." For the Springfield family, that answer was not good enough. And they were not the only family struggling with federal handling of a suspicious death. Around the same time, the family of a man named Stephen Bear Crane Cole was also challenging the FBI's conclusions in another case involving Native victims. Stephen had been shot and killed by a co-worker at a ranch after the shooter claimed self-defense. Photographs showed a knife under Stephen's body still in its sheath, under an electrical cord, raising serious doubts about the shooter's story. Yet the FBI agents handling the case were described as dismissive and impatient. During one meeting with the family, a lead agent even looked up partway through the discussion and asked, "Who is Stephen?" Despite that being the person whose death they were supposed to be investigating, the Springfield family eventually joined a lawsuit involving Stephen's case, arguing that the FBI's pattern of dismissive behavior and shallow investigation represented a broader failure to protect Native American victims. To them, what happened to Robert was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger, deeply rooted problem. When you view Robert's case through that lens, the no foul play conclusion becomes even harder to swallow. So what are the possibilities? If this was not a murder, then what was it? The first non-criminal theory is animal predation. In that scenario, Robert would have been attacked by a bear, mountain lion, or other predator. But that does not explain the neatly rolled belt, the untouched wallet, or the lack of clear mention of claw or tooth marks on the bones. It also does not account for why the body was not found for a year in such a heavily searched area, or how the remains ended up so close to the camp. The second non-criminal theory is exposure or some other natural cause. Perhaps he became disoriented because of his vision impairment, fell, or otherwise injured himself and succumbed to the elements. But again, as a former Marine and experienced outdoorsman, He knew basic survival. He had a lighter, he had clothing and equipment, and according to what we know, there was no sign he built a shelter or created a visible fire. For exposure to have killed him in a way that also fits the odd placement of his belongings requires imagining him making one baffling decision after another. Under this theory, he would have had to walk away from his bow and arrows, carefully remove his belt, roll it up and set it down, take out his wallet and place it beside him, sit against a tree within an easy walk of the search camp, and then die without leaving any other trace. All of this would have had to happen without any searcher or dog detecting him at the time. On the other hand, one theory of homicide can account for all of the known facts with fewer leaps. If someone shot or otherwise killed Robert while he was apart from the others, they could have moved his body, or parts of it, from where he originally fell. They could have left him in a more hidden location during the intense search period, then later returned to the area and placed the remains and some of his belongings near Bear Hole, close enough to the search camp that they would eventually be found. An accidental shooting by another hunter, followed by a panicked attempt to hide the body and later to make things right by returning the remains, is one plausible version. A deliberate killing is another. In that kind of scenario, the missing bow and arrows make sense. They could have been taken away, lost, or deliberately removed from the scene. The rolled belt and placed wallet makes sense. Someone else could have handled those items. The lack of weathering on the wallet makes sense. It may not have actually spent a full year lying exposed on the ground. The body not being found during the big search makes sense. It was not there yet. And the eventual appearance of remains within 50 yards of the camp makes sense. They were positioned where someone knew searchers and hunters would eventually see them. Is this proven? No. We do not have a confession. We do not have documented forensic evidence made public that confirms a gunshot. We do not have a named suspect. What we have is a pattern of facts that line up more neatly under a homicide theory than under the explanations officially accepted. For the Springfield family, and for viewers who care about justice, that leaves a bitter taste. It raises uncomfortable questions, not just about one death in the mountains, but about how often indigenous families are told to accept no foul play when something clearly feels wrong. If you believe stories like this deserve more attention, more pressure, and more public scrutiny, please take a second to hit the like button, share this video with someone who follows true crime, and subscribe to Disturbed Intent. Your engagement is not just a number. It is one small way of refusing to let stories like Robert's quietly fade away. As with many wilderness disappearances and unexplained deaths, some people have tried to reach for stranger explanations in Robert's case. This story has been discussed in books and channels that sometimes lean into paranormal or cryptid theories. The idea that something inhuman might stalk the mountains, something like the legendary Sasquatch or other creatures of oral tradition, is tempting to people who feel that normal explanations have failed. In one popular retelling, this case is mentioned alongside a famous story recorded by future President Theodore Roosevelt in his book, The Wilderness Hunter, published in the late 1893. Roosevelt included what he called a goblin story, told to him by a seasoned frontiersman named Bowman or Bowman. In that tale, two trappers ventured into a remote mountain pass in search of better beaver prospects, despite warnings that a man had been found there previously, apparently killed and partly eaten by some unknown creature. As the story goes, something began to harass their camp. Their lean-to was smashed. Their gear was scattered. Large footprints that did not look quite like a normal bear's appeared around the camp, put down as if the animal had walked on 2 legs instead of 4. Strange vocalizations echoed in the dark woods. A terrible smell accompanied the presence of the unseen visitor. Finally, one of the trappers returned to camp to find his partner dead, his neck broken, with a bite wound at his throat, and evidence in the dirt that some large creature had stomped and rolled over the body in brutal excitement. Roosevelt himself noted that the story could be interpreted as the work of an unusually aggressive and cunning wild animal, possibly a large cat or a bear, and he stopped short of endorsing supernatural explanations. Later writers have connected that goblin to ideas of the Wendigo or to Bigfoot-type creatures in modern folklore. Because that story supposedly took place in the wider region of the Northern Rockies, some have tried to link it, loosely, to modern cases of missing hunters, including Robert's. It is understandable that people reach for legends when the human answers feel unsatisfying. The idea of an unknown beast roaming the high country, selectively targeting hunters, and somehow outsmarting hundreds of searchers and dogs is dramatic. For some, it is easier to imagine a monster than to look at the possibility that a human being did something terrible and that the system failed to properly investigate it. But when we weigh the details in Robert's case against that kind of explanation, the cryptid angle falls apart. A mythical creature does not explain the rolled belt, the intact wallet, or the late appearance of the remains right by the camp. It does not explain the jurisdictional confusion, the bureaucratic delay, the exclusion of the county coroner, or the broader pattern of underinvestigated deaths on indigenous land. A monster, real or imagined, cannot be served a subpoena. It cannot be questioned on the stand. It cannot choose to come forward years later and admit that a shot went wrong and panic took over. What we are left with is harder, messier, and very human. We have a man who loved to hunt, who knew the land well, who was not reckless or inexperienced. We have a family who did everything they could to find him. We have a community that rode horses through snow and fog, cooked meals for searchers, and prayed at a camp in the mountains. We have a body that appears later in a place where it should have been found earlier. We have a system that handled the physical evidence in a way that shut out local authority and delayed answers for years. And we have an official conclusion that refuses to acknowledge how unlikely some of those pieces are unless someone else was involved. Could we be wrong? Yes. It is always possible that a series of unlikely natural events lined up in just the right way, that searchers missed a nearby body, that dogs failed to pick up scent, that weather preserved a wallet better than expected, that the hole in the vest came from something other than a bullet, that an experienced hunter made a chain of bad choices that led to his death, and that the federal investigation was shallow but technically correct in calling the cause of death undetermined. But what matters most is not whether a YouTube channel can solve the case from a distance. What matters is whether the people who had the power to investigate did everything they should have done, the way they would have if the missing hunter had been a wealthy outsider, or a politician's son, or a well-connected businessman. Looking at the facts, listening to the family, and understanding the wider context of cases on reservations, it is hard to feel that they did. For Native families, that feeling is painfully familiar. Missing daughters whose disappearances are brushed off as runaways. Sons whose deaths are quickly written off as accidents, even when evidence suggests otherwise. Calls not returned, files not followed up, explanations that amount to, "We did not find proof of murder, so we are closing the book." At Disturbed Intent, we cannot reopen an official investigation. We cannot subpoena records or force agencies to act. But what we can do is something that has always made power uncomfortable. Keep telling the story. Refuse to let people forget. Refuse to let "no foul play suspected" be the end of the conversation when the facts do not support that certainty. If you are watching this and you feel that same unease, there are small but real things you can do. You can share this video so more people hear Robert Springfield's name. You can support Native-led advocacy groups that fight for better investigations into missing and murdered Indigenous people. And if you live in the United States or Canada, you can contact your representatives and demand to know what is actually being done today to fix the jurisdictional gaps and enforcement failures that let cases like this slip through the cracks. Most of all, you can remember that behind every mystery in the mountains headline is a real family who does not get to turn off the video and walk away when the music fades out. To the Springfield family and to the Crow community, we send respect. Robert was not just a case file. He was a father, a husband, and a hunter who loved the land. He deserved answers in life. His family deserves answers now. If you have watched this far, thank you for staying with me through a difficult story. It helps more than you know. Please like this video so it reaches more people, leave a respectful comment for the family or your thoughts on the case, and hit the subscribe button to stay with Disturbed Intent as we continue to explore real-world mysteries that are as unsettling as any fiction. Until next time, take care of yourselves, look out for each other, and remember, some of the darkest stories are not the ones we invent, but the ones that actually happened.